It was one of those chilly but beautiful late autumn mornings in the town of Maple Hollow, Indiana. The kind of morning where the air felt crisp, the leaves painted the ground in shades of amber and gold, and the world still carried that peaceful hum of small-town safety. For most residents, it was just another ordinary Saturday, but for Emily Sanders, that morning would be burned into her memory forever. Emily's 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, had always loved playing outside after breakfast. Every Saturday, while Emily tidied up the kitchen, Chloe would bundle herself into her favorite bright red jacket, slip into her little rainbow boots, and run outside to the backyard. There was nothing to worry about. Their home sat on the edge of a quiet, safe cul-de-sac where everyone knew each other. The Sanders property backed up against a large neighboring farm owned by Mr. Leonard, an older man who raised horses and had lived in that house long before Emily and her family moved in. His barn stood far enough away that the children rarely ventured near it, but close enough that Emily could always see the wooden roof peeking over the fence. That morning was no different. Chloe ran out happily, carrying her stuffed rabbit, twirling around in the chilly air, her giggles floating back into the kitchen, where Emily watched through the window. She glanced at the clock. 9:14 a.m. Emily wiped down the counters, loaded the dishwasher, and after what felt like only a few minutes, she returned to the door and called out, "Chloe, sweetie, come in for your cocoa." But there was no answer. She stepped outside, expecting to see her daughter sitting by the sandbox or under the oak tree. The yard was empty. The swing hung still. Her little footprints in the thin layer of fresh frost led a few steps across the lawn and vanished near the edge of the wooden fence that divided their property from Leonard's ranch. Panic hadn't set in yet, not at first. It was a small town. Maybe Chloe had wandered around to the side of the house. Maybe she was playing hide-and-seek. Maybe she'd wandered toward the barn, though she knew not to. Emily called again, louder this time. Still nothing. By 9:27 a.m., the panic began. By 9:41 a.m., she was on the phone with 911. The next hours became a blur. Police officers, neighbors, search dogs, and volunteers scoured every inch of the neighborhood, the nearby woods, and the open farmland. Deputies interviewed Mr. Leonard immediately. The old man was visibly shaken. "I didn't see anything, ma'am. Honest," he kept repeating. "I was inside most of the morning. I didn't hear a sound." The barn, the sheds, and every storage building were searched thoroughly that same day. Nothing. No broken locks. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. No footprints beyond the fence. Chloe had simply disappeared, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years, and the missing posters faded along with public hope. But Emily never stopped searching. For 8 long years, she lived in that same house, unable to leave, terrified that if she moved, she might somehow lose the last chance of finding Chloe. Her bedroom remained untouched. Her tiny rainbow boots still sat neatly by the door. The pine stuffed rabbit rested against her pillow, waiting. Then, after 8 cruel years, fate finally shifted. Mr. Leonard, now in his late 70s, had grown too ill to maintain the ranch. The property was sold, and a cleanup crew was brought in to clear out the old horse barn and dismantle some of the unused structures. That's when one of the workers, clearing out an old feeding area behind the barn, noticed something strange beneath. The old feeding trough, partially sunken into the ground, concealed what looked like a hidden compartment, an opening carefully concealed for years. What they found buried underneath would change everything. For Emily, the search that haunted her for nearly a decade was about to uncover a secret darker than anything she ever imagined. The moment the crew discovered the compartment beneath the old feeding trough, everything on that farm froze. The man who found it immediately called his supervisor. Within minutes, the police arrived, sealing off the entire area. Emily received the call she never expected. "Mrs. Sanders, we may have found something. You need to come down here." Her heart pounded against her ribs like a drum as she drove to the farm. Every mile felt longer than the last. The old barn stood silently in the distance, as blue and red lights reflected off its weathered wooden beams. Emily stepped out of her car and was met by Detective Morgan, the lead investigator now assigned to the reopened case. "We're being very careful, Emily," he said gently. "We don't know exactly what's here yet." A team in white forensic suits worked meticulously around the uncovered compartment. The feeding trough, long rusted and barely standing, had been sitting on top of an old wooden hatch. The hatch itself was nailed down and painted to blend in with the dirt floor, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. When they pried the boards loose, the ground beneath revealed layers of plastic sheeting and tightly packed dirt. The hours passed. Evidence technicians slowly unearthed what appeared to be old fabric pieces, bits of deteriorated plastic, and a small child's shoe, tiny, pink, and worn. Emily gasped. "That's hers," she whispered, her legs weakening beneath her. The shoe was unmistakable. It was one of Chloe's favorite pairs, the one she wore almost every Saturday. She had put them on that very morning before vanishing. Detective Morgan studied Emily as she tried to process the sight before her. "We'll analyze everything, Emily. we're taking this very slowly." The crew worked through the night, carefully, removing every layer. The area beneath the barn was deeper than anyone expected. Whoever had built the compartment knew how to conceal it. The space was large enough to fit a small person, maybe more. It was dry, insulated, hidden from the outside world. But one detail haunted everyone on site. There were no human remains. Forensic teams recovered strands of blonde hair embedded in the plastic sheeting. DNA testing would later confirm the hair belonged to Chloe. She was here, Emily whispered again and again. She was here. This discovery reopened every wound, but also unlocked a horrifying possibility that hadn't been fully explored before. Chloe hadn't been killed immediately. She had been kept alive, at least for some time. Detective Morgan expanded the search radius around the property, combing through every inch of the barn, storage sheds, nearby woods, and adjacent fields. Cadaver dogs sniffed tirelessly. Divers were called in to search the old farm well. Drones scanned the thick tree lines for disturbed earth. Metal detectors swept for buried evidence. But days passed, and no further trace of Chloe was found. Emily stayed up most nights, unable to sleep, going through old photos of Chloe's childhood birthday parties, park outings, school plays. Each image was now haunted by the knowledge that someone had watched her daughter, possibly for months, maybe even longer, before she vanished. Investigators reopened the old case files. The original investigation had focused heavily on strangers, traveling workers, drifters, anyone passing through Maple Hollow at the time. But now, with the discovery on Leonard's property, attention shifted much closer to home. Leonard, the former neighbor who owned the farm, was interviewed again. He was now bedridden, weak from illness, but cooperative. "I didn't know anything," Leonard whispered softly. "I swear to you, I never saw a thing." Detectives pressed carefully. "Is there any chance someone else had access to your barn back then?" Leonard nodded slowly. "The ranch hands, I had 3 over the years, but most came and went." Investigators dug into employment records from nearly a decade earlier. One name surfaced: Gregory Dalton, a farmhand hired 2 years before Chloe vanished. He had worked odd jobs for Leonard for several months, helping with livestock, fence, repairs, and barn maintenance. Dalton left abruptly, just weeks after Chloe disappeared. At the time, his sudden departure raised no red flags. He wasn't questioned deeply. He had no criminal record, no prior complaints, no ties to the Sanders family. He simply moved on. But now, with the discovery of the hidden compartment, his departure looked very different. Detective Morgan requested a full background investigation into Gregory Dalton's movements after 1991. Dalton had relocated to another small town, roughly 200 miles away. He married, worked for various construction companies, and maintained a relatively quiet life. On paper, he was just another blue-collar worker. But as the team dug deeper, troubling details began to emerge. Multiple restraining orders had been filed against him by female coworkers in the years after Chloe disappeared. Allegations of harassment, inappropriate behavior, and boundary violations followed him from job to job. No charges ever stuck. He always moved before things escalated. He knew how to slip away quietly, just like he did back then, Detective Morgan whispered as he reviewed the files. Dalton was placed under quiet surveillance. For the first time in 8 years, the investigation had a living suspect. Emily was updated carefully. Her emotions swung between cautious hope and bone-deep terror. "If he knows where my baby went, if he did this, I need to know," she said. Detective Morgan promised her gently, "We're closer than we've ever been." As investigators monitored Dalton's movements, they noticed something odd. He made weekly trips to a remote wooded property he had inherited from an uncle land that had never appeared on earlier records. Could this be the second site? Morgan whispered. Pieces were starting to form, but nothing was certain yet. What they would soon uncover at that property would finally drag the full truth into the light. Gregory Dalton had stayed under the radar for years. Quiet towns, temporary jobs, always moving just enough to avoid real attention. But now, for the first time since Chloe vanished, the weight of his past was beginning to catch up. Detective Morgan authorized a full background reconstruction of Dalton's life. Everything from his childhood to his most recent movements. Dalton was originally from a neighboring county, raised by an unstable single parent who bounced through relationships and jobs. His school records reflected poor attendance, discipline issues, and frequent behavioral incidents involving younger children, disturbing patterns that had never escalated into criminal charges but now painted a much darker picture. "He's the kind that slips between the cracks," Morgan muttered to his team, "always just beneath the surface." The real breakthrough came from Dalton's financial records. While his primary address was listed in a rental unit in town, bank statements showed repeated payments for a separate private property registered under his late uncle's name, a remote, wooded lot about 40 minutes outside of Maple Hollow. This was the property investigators suspected might hold new answers. Drone footage confirmed that Dalton regularly visited the land, driving up narrow dirt roads, staying for hours at a time, even overnight. But there was no visible cabin, trailer, or standing structure, just woods. Detective Morgan filed for an immediate search warrant. The search began early one morning. Teams from multiple agencies arrived quietly to avoid alerting Dalton. K-29 units, forensic specialists, and ground-penetrating radar operators methodically swept through the dense trees. The ground was uneven. Years of natural growth made it difficult to read the landscape, but the dogs reacted quickly. Roughly 300 yards into the property, one of the dogs gave a strong signal. The team halted. They were standing near an oddly leveled patch of ground, roughly 10 feet across, surrounded by piled leaves and broken branches. As investigators carefully brushed away debris, they found disturbed soil that didn't match the surrounding earth. The digging began, layer by layer, inch by inch. They worked their way down, revealing a large, tightly sealed plastic drum, industrial grade, designed to withstand the elements for years. The lid was screwed shut and heavily taped. Detective Morgan stood by silently as the drum was carefully lifted and secured. Its weight alone told them enough. Whatever was inside had been concealed with purpose. At the forensics lab, the drum was opened under controlled conditions. Inside, they found sealed plastic bags, layers upon layers protecting what appeared to be child-sized clothing, a faded stuffed rabbit, and a tiny backpack embroidered with the name Chloe. Emily's breath caught in her throat when detectives showed her photographs of the items. It was her daughter's backpack, still intact after 8 years. The tiny stuffed rabbit had once gone everywhere with Chloe. Even on the morning she vanished, she had taken it outside with her. She was carrying it when she disappeared, Emily whispered through tears. But even now, heartbreakingly, there were still no remains. The drum had been carefully packed, intentionally avoiding any direct evidence of human remains. Forensic specialists examined the clothing fibers, finding tiny traces of blood and long strands of blonde hair embedded in the fabric. The DNA matched Chloe. She was inside this drum at some point, Morgan confirmed. Whether alive or deceased when placed here, we still can't determine yet. The discovery raised terrifying new questions. Had Dalton kept her alive at this location? Was this drum a secondary concealment? Had he moved her remains elsewhere to permanently hide the final truth? The psychological profile became clearer. This level of concealment shows advanced planning. One profiler explained, Dalton likely kept trophies to maintain control. The drum itself may have been his insurance, his way of feeling safe, knowing she was hidden where no one could easily find her. At the same time, Dalton was brought in. For formal questioning, he denied everything. I never knew that little girl. I didn't touch anything at Leonard's barn. I don't know how any of that got there. Investigators pressed him for hours, but Dalton stayed calm, sticking to short, rehearsed lines. He's practiced this story for years, Morgan whispered privately. He's not going to break under normal questioning. Investigators dug deeper. They pulled phone records, old employment logs, and surveillance footage. They discovered that Dalton had visited the Leonard farm multiple times outside of his scheduled work shifts, sometimes late at night, long after chores should have been finished. The night before Chloe vanished, one neighbor recalled seeing Dalton's truck parked near the far edge of the Leonard property, a detail previously dismissed as insignificant. The evidence continued stacking, but prosecutors still needed more, something that tied Dalton directly to the act of abduction and to Chloe's ultimate fate. Morgan authorized a full forensic excavation of the remaining acreage surrounding Dalton's remote property. They weren't finished digging. Nearly 80 feet from the drum, one of the dogs stopped again. This time, the signal was much stronger. Shovels hit something, solidisecond, buried chamber, much deeper, sealed, packed carefully. Beneath layers of concrete blocks and compacted soil, Morgan stood silently as the team prepared to open it. This may be where she really is, he whispered. The crew worked into the night, carefully lifting away each layer of concealment. Beneath it, they would finally uncover what Emily had both prayed for and feared for nearly a decade. The digging site had gone silent as the crew reached the final layer. Every investigator present knew this moment carried the weight of nearly a decade of unanswered questions. Flashlights swept across the freshly uncovered chamber, a concrete-lined hole, no more than 4 feet deep, barely wide enough for a grown adult to crouch inside. Sealed beneath the final slab of poured concrete, forensic specialists carefully exposed a tightly wrapped object, layers of thick industrial plastic and black tarp, carefully folded and bound with heavy rope. Detective Morgan stood nearby, arms crossed tightly across his chest, barely breathing. Take your time, he instructed quietly. Don't risk damaging anything. The wrapping was carefully removed. Inside, what they feared was finally confirmed. Human remains, small, fragile, undoubtedly belonging to a child. The forensic anthropologists worked with precision, documenting every step before removing the remains for full examination. Even in those first few moments, it was clear this was Chloe. The discovery spread through the investigation team like a heavy weave, a moment both deeply painful and, in a tragic sense, a long-awaited piece of closure. Back at the station, Emily was notified gently. Detective Morgan sat with her for nearly an hour before delivering the words. "We found Chloe." Emily froze, her breath breaking in short gasps as her fingers covered her trembling lips. "She's no longer missing." The room filled with a kind of quiet that no mother should ever have to sit inside. Emily wept softly, her body shaking as Morgan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "She can finally come home," he whispered. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis began immediately. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone dreaded. Chloe had likely been alive for at least several days after being taken. The cause of death appeared to be asphyxiation, consistent with manual suffocation or obstruction. No signs of major blunt force trauma or prolonged physical injury were found. She had likely been kept alive and hidden in captivity before being killed. "She was held somewhere before he brought her here," the examiner said softly. The condition of the body suggested she was placed in this secondary burial site shortly after her death, but long after her disappearance. The investigation team reviewed every step of Dalton's movements. It was now clear Dalton abducted Chloe directly from her backyard that morning. He had prepared a small holding location, likely within Leonard's barn, using the hidden compartment under the feeding trough as the first place to hide her. She was kept there for several days while search teams scoured the area, never detecting the concealed chamber directly under their feet. But as media attention grew and the search expanded, Dalton panicked. He carefully transported Chloe to his remote forest property, where he continued keeping her alive in secret for an unknown period before finally ending her life. He had this entire plan mapped out, Morgan muttered to his team. He always had this second sight waiting in case things went wrong. Psychologists brought in to profile Dalton offered chilling insight. Dalton viewed Chloe as an object of obsession. One expert explained, the careful concealment, the trophies. The time he spent preparing it shows long-term fixation rather than a crime of impulse. He studied her patterns for weeks or even months before taking action. Interviews with Leonard, the former neighbor, revealed one more disturbing fact. Dalton was always offering to help after work hours, Leonard recalled. He'd come back after dinner to check on the animals or fix small things. "I never thought anything of it." In reality, those late visits were opportunities to observe Chloe through the fence, to learn her routines, to prepare. He was watching her long before that day, Morgan said heavily. Dalton was brought back into interrogation. For the first time, the full weight of evidence was laid in front of him. The items recovered from the drum, the remains recovered from the forest chamber, the DNA matches, the forensic timelines. Still, Dalton sat in silence, expressionless. "You've hidden the truth for 8 years, Morgan said coldly. "But now she has spoken for herself." But Dalton wouldn't speak. No confession, no emotion, no acknowledgement. In many ways, his silence was his final act of control, but the evidence spoke louder than he ever could. The prosecution now prepared the full case against him. Multiple charges were filed: first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple counts of tampering with evidence. Emily attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the courtroom gallery as her daughter's name was spoken again and again. Though no confession came, the truth was now undeniable. "He may never tell us everything," Morgan told her gently. "But you know the most important part now. You know where your little girl is." But the most devastating detail, why Dalton chose Chloe, still remained locked behind his silence. After the remains were recovered and identified, Maple Hollow entered a strange kind of silence. The town, which had once rallied for Chloe's safe return, now struggled to process the brutal truth. For Emily, grief settled into a new phase, not hope, not uncertainty, but the heavy, irreversible reality of finality. Her daughter was gone. The funeral was small, private, with close family, a few longtime friends, and several members of the investigative team quietly gathered at the cemetery. The tiny white casket rested beneath the shade of a tall oak tree as soft wind rustled through the branches. Emily stood beside the grave, gently holding Chloe's favorite stuffed rabbit, the one recovered from the drum, cleaned and restored. "You're home now, baby," she whispered through her tears. "You're not lost anymore." Even as the town moved forward, the investigation wasn't finished. The case against Gregory Dalton continued building behind closed doors. Prosecutors worked carefully with Detective Morgan's team, combing through every piece of evidence, ensuring nothing was missed. The prosecution's goal was simple: secure a conviction that no defense team could challenge. But Morgan couldn't shake one final question: why Chloe? They had more than enough evidence to prove Dalton's guilt: the abduction, the concealment, the trophies, the burial sites. But Dalton's motive, why he chose Chloe in particular, still remained locked inside his silent, controlled mind. The psychological profiler provided further insight. In these kinds of cases, selection is rarely random. Dalton likely fixated on Chloe long before acting. The proximity, opportunity, and her vulnerability fed his obsession. He may have interacted with her or observed her in ways we don't fully know. Morgan revisited old witness interviews. digging back into statements collected shortly after Chloe disappeared, searching for overlooked threads. That's when he found something buried in the original interview transcripts. One of Leonard's elderly neighbors, Mrs. Callahan, had mentioned something small, something dismissed at the time. That farmhand, the tall one, Dalton, he used to give the children candy sometimes. He seemed friendly enough, always waving at the little ones playing by the fence. At the time, no one thought much of it. The town was small, and neighbors often interacted casually. But in hindsight, it revealed a chilling layer. Dalton hadn't just observed Chloe from a distance. He had likely interacted with her. Morgan requested any available footage from the old neighborhood security cameras, traffic cams, home videos. Most tapes had long since been erased or degraded, but one small home video, recorded by a neighbor during a community picnic several weeks before Chloe disappeared, remained intact. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The video captured neighborhood children playing tag near the edge of Leonard's property. There, in the background, stood Dalton, leaning casually against the fence, watching the children. At one point, Chloe ran past him, laughing. Dalton knelt slightly, appearing to offer her something, likely a small piece of candy. She smiled politely before rejoining the game. The interaction lasted only seconds, harmless at first glance, but in the context of what was now known, it was deeply disturbing. He was testing boundaries, Morgan whispered as he reviewed the footage, grooming her slowly, establishing comfort. Dalton had inserted himself into Chloe's world carefully, almost invisible, friendly encounters, building trust, creating familiarity, and when the opportunity finally came, he acted. Morgan realized the sadistic patience behind Dalton's method. This wasn't about rage or impulse, it was calculated. Emily was informed about the discovery. Though painful, it provided her with one last missing piece she hadn't fully understood. He got close to her, Emily whispered, tears welling. I never even noticed. I never saw it. Morgan reassured her gently. He was careful. Emily, he knew how to blend in. This wasn't your fault. Meanwhile, prosecutors built Dalton's trial strategy with extreme precision. They knew Dalton's defense team would likely argue circumstantial evidence. But what they had now was devastating. Physical evidence, DNA matches, witness testimony, a clear behavioral pattern of pre-abduction grooming, and now video proof of pre-con. The prosecution team moved forward with confidence. The trial date was officially set. Emily prepared herself emotionally for what was ahead. Though exhausted by years of heartbreak, she knew she needed to see it through. I want to hear him face what he did, she whispered. Even if he never speaks, I want him to sit there and hear his name attached to every horror. As jury selection began, the media attention reignited briefly. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Locals debated whether justice could ever fully be served. Inside the courtroom, Dalton remained expressionless, the same cold, detached silence he had carried since his arrest. But behind that blank face, investigators believed something darker still remained because, as comprehensive as the evidence was, they still hadn't uncovered everything. The trial of Gregory Dalton opened in front of a packed courtroom. Nearly every seat was filled with reporters, local residents, families from across the town, many of whom had lived through the pain of Chloe's disappearance for nearly a decade. Emily sat quietly near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but steady. She had waited 8 years for this moment. Now she was ready to hear every detail, no matter how brutal. The prosecution began laying out its carefully constructed case. Photos of the recovered burial sites were displayed: the drum, the underground chamber, the carefully wrapped plastic, the clothing, the backpack, the stuffed rabbit. The jury listened in near total silence as the medical examiner described Chloe's cause of death. The clinical words hit like hammers: asphyxiation, consistent with manual obstruction of the airway. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, her breath shallow, but she didn't break. She needed to hear it all. The prosecution presented its timeline. Dalton had been working at Leonard's farm during the time leading up to Chloe's abduction. He studied Chloe's routine over weeks, slowly building comfort through brief, seemingly harmless encounters. The hidden chamber under the feeding trough had been carefully constructed to hide Chloe for days. As the search intensified, Dalton, panicked, moved Chloe to his secondary property, and later murdered her to permanently eliminate any risk of discovery. The most haunting evidence came next: the home video clip. As the blurry footage played, the courtroom watched Chloe run near Dalton, who leaned down, offering her something, a seemingly innocent gesture. But the context now was chilling. He had access. He had proximity. He built trust. The prosecutor stated. The defense struggled to counter. They tried to argue that much of the evidence was circumstantial, claiming that Dalton's presence in the neighborhood was part of his job and that the drum and burial site could have been manipulated by someone else. But every argument weakened as the mountain of evidence kept growing. The psychological profiler was called to testify next. Dalton demonstrated a clear predatory pattern of behavior, the expert explained. This was not spontaneous. This was calculated. He observed, groomed, isolated, abducted, concealed, and eventually murdered. The jury absorbed every word. The mood inside the courtroom was heavy. You could feel the weight pressing against everyone's chest. What haunted Emily most was hearing the forensic analysis of how long Chloe had likely been held alive. Based on evidence recovered from both locations, the forensic specialist testified, "We estimate that Chloe may have been alive for multiple days, possibly several weeks, after her disappearance." Emily gasped softly. Her friend, seated beside her, gently placed a hand over hers. It was the worst kind of heartbreak to know that Chloe had lived for days, maybe weeks, possibly crying for help that never came. Detective Morgan was called to the stand. He recounted the discovery at both burial sites, the search through Dalton's background, and the final breakthrough of the video footage that showed Dalton engaging with Chloe. His voice was steady as he explained the investigative timeline. He didn't dramatize or sensationalize, just the cold truth of methodical work that had slowly closed the net around Dalton after 8 agonizing years. But then, just as the prosecution was preparing to rest its case, something unexpected happened. The lead prosecutor approached the bench and requested a private conference with the judge and Dalton's defense attorney. Whispers filled the courtroom. Emily's stomach turned. Something was happening. In private chambers, Dalton's attorney had delivered a message. Dalton wanted to speak, but only if prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The prosecution team debated for several tense hours. Ultimately, they agreed. The chance to finally hear the full truth directly from Dalton's mouth was worth more than the death penalty. The courtroom reconvened. The judge allowed Dalton to address the court directly. Under oath, for the first time since his arrest, he would speak. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared across the room at the man who had destroyed her family. Dalton sat forward, his voice disturbingly calm. "I never planned on hurting anyone," he began. "I watched her for weeks. I didn't mean to take her that morning." The courtroom sat frozen, but she was always out there alone. "She trusted me. I didn't force her. She followed me behind the fence toward the barn. She wasn't scared, not at first." Emily's hands clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. "When I had her hidden, I thought maybe I could keep her safe, just for a while. I didn't think anyone would find out. But then the search started, the helicopters, the police. I knew it wouldn't last." Dalton paused. His voice cracked for a moment, but his expression remained blank. "I moved her to my other place. I didn't want to hurt her, but she cried all the time. She begged to go home." Emily felt her vision blur with tears. She was so small, so scared. Dalton continued. "One night, she screamed too loudly. I panicked. I covered her mouth. She stopped breathing." The courtroom was absolutely silent, the horror hanging in the air. Dalton finished with chilling detachment. "I buried her so no one would find her. I'm sorry." There was no emotion behind the words, no grief, no guilt, only a cold, flat explanation. Emily wept quietly. The words she had waited nearly a decade to hear were more devastating than she ever could have prepared for. Her baby had trusted him, had followed him willingly, and paid the ultimate price for innocence. The courtroom was adjourned for the day. The prosecution would return for final sentencing. But the truth was now complete. What remained was no longer whether Dalton was guilty, but simply how the court would punish him. The courtroom remained heavy with silence even after Dalton's chilling testimony. For the first time in nearly a decade, the events of that morning were no longer clouded by questions. But even as Dalton confessed to the core of his crime, the detectives, especially Detective Morgan, knew there were still layers left untold. "There's more," Morgan told his team behind closed doors. "He's giving us a version that makes him seem less evil." But predators like Dalton don't stop at panic. Forensic psychologists often referred to it as minimization, the way offenders soften the full horror of what they've done to make their actions seem accidental or somehow less monstrous. "I panicked. I didn't mean to. I only wanted to keep her safe." Morgan had heard it before. They always panic, but the preparation says otherwise. Dalton's version conveniently skipped over months of planning, the repeated late-night visits to Leonard's barn, the carefully built underground chamber, the industrial storage drum, the remote secondary burial site. Those were not the actions of a man who panicked, they were the acts of someone who had thought about this far longer than he was admitting. Outside the courtroom, Emily struggled to absorb the weight of Dalton's words. She barely slept that night. Her mind replayed his cold voice again and again. "She wasn't scared at first. She followed me. She begged to go home." The thought that Chloe trusted him, that she followed him willingly, made Emily's grief even harder to bear, because it wasn't just abduction, it was betrayal. "He made her feel safe," she whispered bitterly, "and then he stole everything." Her therapist met with her quietly the following morning. "What you're feeling is normal, Emily. Victims like Chloe are often groomed long before the abduction ever happens." The word groomed echoed in Emily's mind. She realized something she hadn't fully faced before. Chloe never stood a chance. Dalton wasn't a man who lost control one day. He was a man who built this moment carefully, piece by piece. Long before that morning, back at the station, Detective Morgan continued reviewing Dalton's older case files. One particular document stood out, a forgotten tip from the very early days of the investigation. 8 days after Chloe disappeared, a local hardware store owner had reported a man purchasing large plastic sheeting, industrial-strength duct tape, heavy rope, and soil sealant. At the time, with no suspect in custody, the tip had been logged and set aside. When cross-referenced now, the description of the man matched Dalton's height, build, and general appearance. He was preparing for concealment from the very start. Morgan muttered. This wasn't panic after the fact. He always intended to hide her. Investigators then revisited Dalton's earlier employment files. Another dark pattern emerged. Before coming to Leonard's farm, Dalton had worked briefly at a children's petting zoo 2 counties away. The zoo had fired him after a complaint was filed by a concerned mother who claimed Dalton was too friendly with her young daughter. The incident was never reported to law enforcement, and no charges were filed. He simply moved on quietly, carefully. This man has likely been escalating for years, Morgan said to the prosecutor. Chloe may not have been his first obsession, she was simply the one he acted on. The prosecution team debated whether to present these prior behavioral patterns to the court during sentencing. Though not directly tied to Chloe's murder, it painted a devastating portrait of Dalton's true predatory nature. Ultimately, the judge allowed the evidence to be introduced. During the final phase of the trial, the court heard disturbing testimony, former co-workers describing Dalton's boundary violations, mothers who had grown uneasy with his attention toward their children, supervisors who had quietly fired him, but never reported his conduct. The jury listened as the picture darkened further. Dalton wasn't a man who panicked one time. He was a man who spent years honing his manipulation. The lead prosecutor stood before the court. Gregory Dalton did not simply lose control one morning. He stalked, he studied, he groomed, and when the time was right, he struck. Every decision after Chloe's disappearance was part of a long, calculated plan to hide his crime. Emily listened, through tears, her heartbreak now mixed with a bitter kind of anger. He knew exactly what he was doing, she whispered to Morgan outside the courtroom. He just didn't think we'd ever find him. Morgan nodded quietly. We were lucky to catch him, Emily. But the truth is, people like Dalton don't stop until someone does. As sentencing approached, the courtroom braced for closure. But just as it seemed everything had finally been revealed, one final horrifying truth was about to emerge, one that even Emily, after all these years, wasn't prepared for. As the final days of sentencing approached, Emily found herself living in a strange space between grief and numbness. She had survived the investigation. She had heard Dalton's horrifying confession. She had sat through every second of his trial. But something inside her still felt unsettled, like a heavy door hadn't fully closed yet. Detective Morgan sensed it, too. He'd worked enough of these cases to know that when men like Dalton speak, they often hold back the ugliest details. They confess just enough to secure a lighter punishment or to create an illusion of remorse. There's still something he's not telling us, Morgan said to his team quietly. Something worse. That lingering suspicion haunted everyone. The prosecution continued digging. Even though the core charges were already secured, Morgan authorized his team to re-examine everything. The old files, the original scene photos, the sealed evidence boxes. Every minor detail was revisited. That's when they found it. In one of the original property searches, buried deep in an evidence locker, was a small cardboard box from Leonard's barn. It had been logged early in the investigation, but never thoroughly examined because it appeared unrelated at the time. Inside were miscellaneous farm documents, old receipts, some broken tools, and one old camera, cheap disposable film camera, still sealed, never developed. Back then, film rolls from areas unrelated to the main crime scene were often deprioritized. Now, nearly a decade later, this forgotten piece of evidence sat waiting. The camera was carefully rushed to the forensic photo lab. Technicians worked cautiously, aware that time and degradation might have ruined the film, but frame after frame emerged intact. Most were innocent images. Horses in the barn, fields of crops, standard farm scenery. Then came one frame that made the technician freeze, a blurry image, clearly accidental, showing the interior of Leonard's barn. In the background stood Chloe, and beside her, partially turned, but unmistakably identifiable, was Dalton. His hand rested on her shoulder. She was wearing the same red jacket from the morning she disappeared. The timestamp on the film placed the photo 2 full days after Chloe's abduction. This single photograph shattered Dalton's carefully constructed version of events. He hadn't simply panicked and killed her that first night. He had kept her alive for days, just like investigators had feared. But more than that, the picture revealed something even more disturbing. In the background, partially captured behind Dalton, was a folding cot, a small table, and what appeared to be a portable space heater. He had built a makeshift holding area, Morgan whispered, a place to keep her alive, hidden right under everyone's noses while we searched. The location of the photo matched perfectly with the hidden chamber beneath the feeding trough. Chloe hadn't been moved immediately. She was concealed inside the barn for days, while police, volunteers, and neighbors searched above her. She was right there the entire time, Morgan said heavily. We were standing on top of her. The implications devastated Emily when she was shown the photograph. Her daughter had cried for help just yards from where search parties had gathered. The sounds of helicopters, police radios, and rescue dogs would have filled the air, but she was trapped beneath the floor, unheard. I was so close to her, Emily whispered, staring at the photo, her voice breaking. She could probably hear my voice, and I couldn't hear hers. Her sobs filled the room. Morgan stayed quiet, letting her cry. There were no words for pain like that. Dalton was confronted with the photo during a final pre-sentencing interview. For the first time since his arrest, his face changed, his eyes twitched. His jaw tightened, but still, he remained mostly silent. That was never supposed to be found, he muttered under his breath. Morgan leaned in closer. You knew we were closed that week, didn't you? You heard the search teams. You heard us calling for her, and yet you kept her hidden, knowing her mother was just feet away. Dalton didn't answer. He simply stared ahead. The judge was shown the newly recovered evidence. The jury saw the photo during sentencing. The courtroom's heavy silence returned as the prosecution presented the final timeline. Dalton stalked Chloe for weeks. He lured her into the barn, hiding her beneath the feeding trough. He held her alive for multiple days during the community search efforts. When the investigation intensified, he moved her to the forest property and ultimately ended her life. The depth of Dalton's cruelty was now undeniable. Emily sat motionless throughout the presentation. She had no more tears left. Her grief had shifted into something harder, colder, a quiet rage tempered only by the comfort that the world finally saw Dalton for who he truly was. But even after everything exposed in court, Morgan and the prosecution believed one last piece still sat buried deep inside Dalton's twisted mind. After nearly a decade, after months of trial, after Dalton's twisted partial confession, everything now pointed toward one final truth that still hadn't been spoken. Even with the damning photo evidence, Dalton had never fully explained why he had fixated on Chloe. What drew him to her? Why her? Detective Morgan sat quietly in the small interview room one last time. Dalton was brought in under heavy security. This wasn't an official interrogation. The trial was essentially over. The conviction was secure. The sentencing was imminent. But Morgan wanted the last piece, the one Dalton had kept buried. This is your only chance to explain, Gregory, Morgan began calmly. Not for the court, not for your sentence, but for her. Mother. For a long while, Dalton said nothing. He stared at the tabletop, his fingers loosely interlocked. Shoulders relaxed, the same cold, emotionless posture he had maintained for years. But then, for reasons Morgan couldn't fully explain, Dalton finally spoke. It wasn't random, he said softly. It was never random. Morgan leaned forward slightly. Then tell me. Dalton exhaled slowly. I first saw her at the farm fence. She was always out there playing when I worked late. The way she smiled, the way she looked up at me every time I waved, she reminded me of someone. Morgan's brow tightened, who Dalton's voice lowered, but his tone remained disturbingly detached. My little sister. Morgan's breath caught. You had a sister. Dalton nodded. She died when I was 12, drowned in the creek behind our house. I couldn't save her. Suddenly, a dark, chilling portrait began to form. Chloe looked like her, Dalton continued. Same blonde hair, same little red jacket. Every time I saw her, it felt like I was looking at my sister again. I thought maybe I could fix what I couldn't fix back then. Morgan's stomach turned. It was a twisted kind of logic, delusion feeding into obsession. You convinced yourself that taking Chloe was somehow redemption. Dalton's lip twitched. I didn't mean to hurt her, not at first. I just wanted to keep her close, to protect her, to not lose her like I lost my sister. Morgan's voice hardened. You didn't protect her, you destroyed her, you killed a child. Dalton didn't flinch. She cried too much, he said softly. She wanted her mother, she didn't understand. It got too risky, I couldn't let her go. Morgan sat back, his chest tight. This was it, the final sickening truth. Dalton hadn't panicked. He hadn't lost control. He had pursued Chloe deliberately, projecting his unresolved childhood trauma onto her. He groomed her, abducted her, isolated her, suffocated her, all in a desperate, broken attempt to recreate control over the one loss he had never processed. His sister, Morgan, stood quietly, fighting the urge to lash out. There was nothing left to say. Dalton had finally given him the last dark corner of his mind and confirmed the horror that Emily had long feared but never fully understood. In court, this final piece was presented during sentencing. The judge addressed Dalton directly, his voice stern and heavy. You didn't simply abduct this child. You hunted her. You imposed your sick obsession onto an innocent little girl who trusted you. Your calculated actions destroyed not only Chloe's life but her family's future. Dalton remained silent as the sentence was delivered. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. After court, Emily stepped outside into the cool autumn air. The cameras and reporters stood at a respectful distance as she walked toward the edge of the courthouse steps, tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't only tears of grief, they were tears of survival. "I finally know everything now," she whispered quietly to herself. "I finally know what he stole from me, and I finally know it's over." The wind blew gently as she closed her eyes and whispered one last time to her daughter, "You're free now, baby, you're free." The nightmare that had haunted her for nearly a decade was finally over. 6 months after the sentencing, Emily stood alone at Chloe's gravesite. The early spring wind brushed gently against her face. Tiny wildflowers had begun blooming across the soft green grass, and the willow tree overhead swayed quietly, like it was breathing with her. The headstone was simple: Chloe Marie Sanders, 1984 to 1991, forever loved, forever missed. Emily knelt and placed a small photo beside the flowers, one of Chloe, smiling wide on her 7th birthday, holding her stuffed rabbit. "You're safe now, sweet girl," she whispered softly. "He'll never hurt you again, and I'll carry you with me every single day." There was no longer any mystery left, no more dark corners to fear. Dalton would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and Chloe's story had finally been fully told. The people of Maple Hollow never forgot her. Her case became part of the town's history, a reminder of both darkness and the strength of a mother's love that never gave up. Emily stood for a moment longer, breathing in the silence, then whispered one final promise: "You were never lost. I found you, baby." And with that, she quietly walked away into the morning.